So I'm here to talk to you today about Canadian science at risk. Jim asked if I would paint a picture for you of what is happening to science by way of federal government policy and their decisions about funding cuts. Unfortunately, to paint a complete picture would require a canvas of unimaginable size. So what I'm going to try to do for you is to paint a postage stamp and ask that you understand that this is part of really a broader picture of what's happening to science in Canada. So first I'll tell you just a little bit about my story and about the work that I've been doing over the last number of years, really since I started as a graduate student back in 1994. I work in the high Arctic at a place called Eureka. It's just about as far north as you can go. If you look at the slide there, there's a little pointer and it shows it's at 80 degrees north. It's just a little bit south of the early warning station at Alert. At Eureka, there is a weather station called the Eureka Weather Station, and it's been run by Environment Canada for the last 60 years or so. As well, there has been a group operating up there that I'm part of called CANDAC, the Canadian Network for the Detection of Atmospheric Change. And we operate the Pearl Lab, or actually the Pearl Complex of labs. And what we do up there is we look at ozone depletion, we look at pollutants coming into the Arctic, we look at climate change. And of course, these are all very important pressing issues in the high Arctic, and they have lots of important impacts for us here at more southerly latitudes as well. So I want to show you a few postcards from Eureka, just to try to give you a feel for the place. It's at 80 degrees north, the North Pole's at 90 degrees, so this is way, way up there. We fly in small aircraft to get up there. This is a picture of a twin otter. When you fly over the station, it's really just a small little collection of buildings. There's actually no town nearby. The nearest town is several hundred kilometers toward the south, and it's a small town of something like 50 people. The scenery is stunning. It's absolutely unparalleled. So there's a picture of your high Arctic. This is a view from the lab out over the fjord and with some mountains in the distance. Incredibly, there's lots of wildlife around this place, and that was one of the things I think that surprised me most when I first visited there. We have Arctic wolves, hares, foxes, lemmings, birds, and the wolves that I showed you just before, and muskox as well. So the place actually has quite a bit of wildlife. But why are we there? Again, we're there to take measurements and to try to understand the impact of human activities on the environment up north. So this is a photo of one of the most important things that happens there. This is a picture of the launch of a weather balloon, an ozone sonde is what it's called. And we launch these things, Environment Canada launches these things to measure and observe the ozone layer and to witness ozone depletions in the spring. And of course, we've been seeing ozone depletions for decades now, and we're trying to monitor our progress on correcting this overall problem. So that's on the government side of things, but as well, what we have here is this iconic red lab. This lab was built by Environment Canada back in 1992, and it's a lab that we do a lot of our more academic research from. So at this lab, for example, we also do measurements of ozone depletion, but we look at chemical fingerprints in the atmosphere to try to understand what's causing it and what's happening. As CANDAC, we've also built a number of new facilities up there. This is one of our newer facilities called Opal. And at Opal, we do climate process research. So we try to look at different aspects of climate to try to understand just what's going on up there. And if we can understand what's going on up there, hopefully we can understand something more about what the future has in store for the Arctic. And it turns out that the picture right now at the moment doesn't look so good. The high Arctic is in deep, deep trouble. If you have a look at this picture here, you will see a hillside that is just disintegrating. So these are called thaw slumps. And what's going on in the Arctic right now is it's warming up to such an extent that the permafrost is thawing and the terrain is literally beginning to collapse. So this is a picture just from a couple years ago, something we had never seen in the 20 years since I've been going up there, of the actual terrain collapsing under the weight of climate change. Okay, so now let's get into the nuts and bolts of how we actually operate Pearl and operate the whole research facility up there. There are many different kinds of funding, okay, that you need to run a place like this. It turned out it used to be a lot easier. Environment Canada used to take care of it, and then for whatever reasons the government lost interest, and a lot of it started to fall directly onto the university-based researchers. So we have two different pools of funding that we might, that we're going to need. We need money for infrastructure, all right, so for the buildings we have up there, for the instrumentation and all of that, but you also have operational money that you're going to need in order to pay your scientists, to fund flights up there, to actually keep the buildings warm. There's lots of upfront costs when operating in the Arctic. So let me show you a few of the different organizations we have that provide funding for our research. There is the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, and also the Arctic Research Infrastructure Fund. These are both Government of Canada programs that you can get money from to build the kind of equipment that you're going to need to do your research. But as well, there's a whole slew of other organizations that have funded the work of CADAC at Pearl, the Polar Environment Atmospheric Research Lab. An example here is the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science. You've also got NSERC, which contributes money through their Major Resource Support Fund. There is the International Polar Year Fund that has supplied us with a fair bit of funding. Environment Canada makes a number of in-kind contributions to our work. There's the Polar Continental Shelf Program, and there is also the Canadian Space Agency. So what you see here is just how incredibly fragmented funding for science in the Arctic got over the last decade or so. Now, you probably heard, you saw in the news that the Pearl Lab is in great trouble, okay? And it's in great trouble because we lost the vast majority of our funding. Keep in mind, this is Canada's flagship Arctic observatory, okay? And it is unique in the world, all right? What happens at the lab is the best in the world. Well, just a few years ago, Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science had their mandate cancelled, so we lost them, and they provided the vast majority of the funds that we used to fund all of the students, their travel, research associates, technicians, I mean really all the people money that we had, and this organization was dissolved by the federal government. I'll talk more about them shortly. There's also NSERC's Major Resource Support. While the government was claiming that they were putting more money into NSERC, they weren't, incidentally. If you actually look at the budget documents, it was a reduction. NSERC ultimately had to put their Major Resource Support Fund on moratorium, and this paid for a lot of the things that we needed, like heating the buildings and that sort of thing. All of the money that was invested in Canadian science during International Polar Year also disappeared as well. There was no legacy fund that came on after that to continue a legacy of all of the important work that was happening in the high Arctic during the International Polar Year 2007-2008. So that doesn't leave very much left. The two up top, we've already got the instruments by and large that we need. What we need is funds to actually be able to operate those things, and the vast majority of that funding is gone. Environment Canada doesn't provide any direct funds for our use. Polar Continental Shelf, it's a kind of year-to-year thing. CSA has been the only group who's enabled us to keep any presence up there at all, and that's only for a few weeks around polar sunrise every spring. So we've gone from operating year-round to really just a tiny little bit of research, something that enables us at least to keep things moving. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science. This has been the dominant funder of atmospheric science and climate research in Canada for the last decade. They were established in 2000 by the government of the time, and they supplied about $122 million for research over 12 years. Now, really, most of that money went out in a 9 to 10 year time scale. In the last couple of years, there were little dribs and drabs that went out, but really they were closing the books during that time. So the average amount of funding that was going out was something on the order of $12 million a year into atmospheric science and climate change research. Their mandate was terminated in March 2012. All of the people were laid off, and they now no longer exist as an entity. There is a new organization that is still maintaining their website called the Canadian Climate Forum. So you can actually get access to all of their documents still. So that's a lot of money that's been taken out of atmospheric science. Now in 2011, the government promised that there would be a new fund that would come to replace what we lost with CFCAS. Of course, it would only be replaced at the 60% level. This is in budget 2011. Nothing happened for a whole year until people started to agitate about it and say, what happened to this promise? So they finally had a competition at NSERC. The results of that competition were supposed to be announced this first quarter of this year, and we still have yet to hear. So this is a big problem. The impact? Well, if I was to invite all of you not to take a salary on for a year or two, I suspect that this would be a pretty empty room. Okay? When you can't pay people, they leave. And they leave the country. And they go and work in the US, they go and work in the UK, they go and work all around the world. Why? They can get jobs. The people we employ are the best people. And they can find work elsewhere. And they're never coming back. So it's a real tragedy for Canadian science. So I'm not just talking about Pearl here. You have to understand that CFCAS funded lots and lots of research across this country, research that is largely not happening anymore because we've suffered catastrophic personnel losses. So when Minister of Science and Technology Gary Goodyear says no government in the history of this country has supported science as much as this government has, I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling the love. Okay? And neither is really anyone else I know. The reality on the ground is that science in Canada is hurting in the worst way. So whenever you hear these pronouncements that they're putting all of this money into science, you really have to take it with a grain of salt. Talk to your faculty. Get their first-hand stories, and I can promise they're going to paint an entirely different picture of what's going on. What else might Minister Goodyear be talking about? Well, maybe in our context, at any rate, he's talking about the Canadian High Arctic Research Station. So this is a new research station that the government is building at Cambridge Bay. So you can see Eureka up there in the high Arctic at 80 degrees north. Cambridge Bay is actually just above the Arctic Circle. So the name is a lie. And you really have to be careful when you hear what this government's saying to really interpret it in context. The Canadian High Arctic Research Station, which is apparently supposed to be all things to all people, was never asked for by the scientific community. We don't want it. It's not in the right place. It's not where you need to be to look at ozone depletion. It's not where you need to be on the cutting edge of Arctic climate change. It's just not where we need. It's not where any glaciers are. It's not where any of the interesting things are happening. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Harper announced this in a throne speech in 2007. I suppose this is going to be his great legacy. Construction actually isn't even supposed to begin until 2014, and it'll open in 2017. I don't really expect there'll be many Arctic researchers left by that time. This is a really interesting photograph, by the way. This is a picture of the Prime Minister with thumbs up in front of some melting sea ice. It's quite a visual. So, something I want to point out, when they say that in Cambridge Bay, they can do the high Arctic research at the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, the distance between Eureka and Cambridge Bay is about 1,000 kilometers. The distance between Cambridge Bay and Fort McMurray, which is where the oil sands, the center of oil sands territory, is about the same distance. So saying you can do high Arctic research at Cambridge Bay is like saying that you can do Arctic research in the middle of the oil sands. It really just doesn't make any sense. Well, until you look at their top priorities. And the top priorities, these are the top two right off their webpage. The first one is economic development, which of course is code for resource extraction. And the second one is stewardship, which I'm pretty confident is also code for resource extraction. Okay? Number three is science, and I'm pretty sure that's code for resource extraction as well. So, anyway, enough about the Arctic. What is happening with Pearl and with all of our Arctic research, it is really, again, just symptomatic of a much larger problem. And I want to highlight a few different other issues that certainly affect all of your membership. For example, at NSERC, Jim's already talked about the loss of grants at NSERC, the declining budgets. I want to talk specifically about the Discovery Grant program. Now, the Discovery Grant program is a program that really provides the base funding for pure research, okay, for basic research at our universities. Here's a nice little graph that shows you what the funding has been like in the Discovery Grant program for the last number of years. And what you can see is that there has been a gradual decline in the unadjusted awards. So these are just the absolute sums that you can find on from Treasury Board reports. Now, if you take inflation into account, I mean, you see there's a decrease, and it's been decreasing since very early. But if you actually adjust this value for inflation, you discover that between the beginning and the end, there is about a 24% reduction in the funds available through the Discovery Grant at NSERC, which again is providing the base funding for basic research at our universities. There's another lens we can look at this through, and that's the lens of GDP. Our GDP has increased by 36% between 2006 and 2011. So any way you can look at this graph, despite what we're being told, it's a decrease, and it's a substantial decrease in investment in basic research, not just in climate, not just in the Arctic, but I'm talking across the board here. How am I doing for time, Jim? All right. Well, let's paint the picture. Let's look a little farther. I want to show you some of the headlines that we've seen in the last number of months. There wasn't much going on a couple of years ago, but now the headlines about cuts to science are absolutely relentless. It's not just happening at the universities. The federal government, the impact of cutbacks to federal government research have been absolutely devastating. Here is a headline: Unique Glacier Research Facility in Yukon hit by federal cuts. So this is the Kluane Lake Research Facility, and as my understanding, it's been cut outright. The Experimental Lakes Area, the world-famous Experimental Lakes Area that really doesn't have a parallel in this world, has been at risk of closure. And we're going to hear more about that from Britt in a few minutes. Environment Canada. This one, there's a certain amount of irony here. They decided that they were going to cut the entire ozone monitoring program, or I should say the entire ozone research program. And the news of that came out only months after we saw the very first ozone hole in the Canadian Arctic. So that shows you something about where our current government is at. Of course, the cuts at Environment Canada have been deep and far-reaching, not just to the ozone program, but I have this huge list, actually, that I started to compile just this morning. Ozone research, aircraft measurements, solar radiation, climate adaptation, coral net, iodine, Woodsea, mercury monitoring, inlet. That's only half the list, okay? It goes on, and I probably missed a lot here. So there's a lot of things at Environment Canada, a lot of research programs that have just been closed down. And these are important research programs that serve to protect the health and safety of Canadians. We're going to feel this, okay? What else? Department of Fisheries and Oceans has really been raked over the coals as well, just like Environment Canada. $100 million being cut out of their budget for the next, over the next 3 years. The Marine Contaminants Program, this is the program that monitors our oceans for pollution, has been cut. If you can believe, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans isn't going to be monitoring our waterways that are going to have super tankers going back and forth carrying dilbit to wherever that dilbit is destined for. National Research Council has really had huge changes made to it as well, and I think that there are many untold stories that haven't come out of it. This headline is Good National Research Council to Refocus to Serve Business. Jim showed me something this morning that said that they were going to be turned into a concierge service for business. I'm not even too sure what that means, but it doesn't sound good.
The scientists are going to be carrying business people's bags.
There you go. And last but not least, this headline saying the closure of the fisheries libraries is called a disaster for Canadian science. And I'm pretty sure that as soon as they start going after the librarians and the libraries, that we have a big problem on our hands. Oh, a couple of other quick headlines. I'm sure that we've all heard about the muzzling of scientists, and that the Information Commissioner is actually investigating the muzzling of scientists. And the evidence for it is extremely strong. Okay? There's been a lot in the news about it. We have a number of different examples of scientists who have been muzzled. There's been Christy Miller at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, David Tarasik at Environment Canada, Scott Dallimore at NRC, Marley Weiser again at Environment Canada. There are a number of individuals we know, but there's also more systematic muzzling. It turns out that Department of Fisheries and Oceans now has a policy that allows managers there to suppress scientific publishing. No joke, okay? A manager there can actually say, no, we're not going to allow you to publish that. This is part of their official policy. And there's been lots of news on that in recent weeks, and you can look that up. And this is my last headline that I want to show you. This is Joe Oliver, our Minister of Natural Resources, just yesterday, condemning climatologist Jim Hansen. Now, Jim Hansen is one of the pillars of the climate change community. 25 years ago, he testified before Congress and told them all about what we would come to expect with climate change. He's done some of the best research on this subject, and Minister Oliver castigated Jim Hansen for his exaggerated rhetoric, and let's see if I get this right, he called his views frankly nonsense. I'm not sure how you can say that the views of a pillar of the scientific community are frankly nonsense, but there you have it. So, hopefully I've painted a picture that helps you to understand that we have a real problem on our hands. And this is only, again, a postage stamp. I could stand up here for hours. I'm pretty sure I'm already over time. How did it come to this? So the whole of public science is at risk, and I think a large part of it has had to do, I think we have to look at ourselves and understand the role that we played in this, and how maybe we can change this. I certainly don't have all the answers on this, but maybe I'll just share a few ideas. Canadians largely don't understand the role of science in their lives. Why? Because we have really failed in engaging with them on those issues. They don't understand how science impacts, or should at least impact, all of the decisions that our government makes on our behalf. Because of this, the politicians now recognize that their decisions are no longer constrained by evidence. So I think this war on science and reason was just completely inevitable. Okay, if people lose track of why what we do is important, they're not going to pay for it. They're not going to be willing to support it. So I think we need to get out there and make the arguments that what we do is important, and really work on our messages about why it's important. So the way forward, there's a fork in the road here. Okay, what do we do now? Again, I think that there has to be increased engagement with the media, politicians, and the public at large. I've done a lot of work engaging with the media and politicians. They're not as scary as you think. Okay? You know, they're normal people, right? They're interested in the world around them, and I found that across the board they've been very receptive to the kind of arguments that we make. They're interested to hear in what we do. They're asking to talk to scientists all the time. Scientists, unfortunately, don't always talk back, and I think we probably should. I think there are crucial roles for groups like CAUT, PIPSC, E4D, it's a new group called Evidence for Democracy. I think there are crucial roles that these groups can play in giving us forums to actually discuss these issues and to talk to, connect us to members of the press and to connect to politicians as well. And finally, I think organization is essential. I think this is wonderful we're talking about this here today. There are many other groups as well who are starting to discuss these issues and organize around them. I think we really need to do what we can to connect these different groups together, share information, work on our messages, and get those messages out there to the public and make sure that they're heard. So that's all I had to say at the end, but hopefully not. Thank you very much.